My name is Steve Phillip, and I'm the founder and director of the Jordan Legacy CIC. It was on December the 4th of 2019, a fairly regular working day for me as a consultant working in the Midlands with a large automotive company, that I got into my car ready to drive back to North Yorkshire, probably a drive of about 3.5 hours. I received an incoming call from the girlfriend of my 34-year-old son, Jordan. And I had no reason to suspect it was going to be anything other than a friendly call and see how I was doing, or a little bit of news, or an invitation to a barbecue. But in the next few minutes, Charlotte explained to me that she'd come to Jordan's house and just kept apologizing and telling me that Jordan had killed himself. And in that moment, as you can probably imagine, my world just completely changed, turned upside down, and those of anyone that Jordan knew, loved, and family members, our lives were never going to be the same again. Yeah, it's really interesting looking back, and something I've spoken about a lot. I think very personally, for me, I took on a role immediately of dealing with the aftermath and all that has to be dealt with, from the police to the coroners to Jordan's personal affairs and contacting family members. But I know that there were, and I think because I threw myself into these types of projects, I didn't go through a grieving process in the traditional sense, but I was very conscious that I experienced what we would call some form of physical trauma, probably mentally related. And that would manifest itself in the way of violent head twitches. I would be sitting on a sofa and my head would literally twitch from one side to another. I would have moments that I often describe of almost like being punched in the stomach, where I would suddenly be knocked backwards. I'd be standing up in the kitchen or somewhere, and suddenly it was as if someone had punched me in the midriff and I'd be knocked backwards. There were these moments that I can now look back and although never diagnosed formally, think were probably some form of post-traumatic stress disorder. So there was definitely physical symptoms that I experienced, and as we all did, lack of sleep, for which we were prescribed sleeping medication for. So in the early days, that was certainly some of the experience, but I did a very typical male thing, I think, perhaps in many ways, and kind of threw myself into operational mode, and have continued ever since, probably to do so. You know, the impact was wide-ranging. We know statistically, on average, that each suicide will impact directly or indirectly 135 other people. And if we think about that for a moment, with 6,000 plus deaths by suicide in the UK every year, that means some 800,000 people are impacted by suicide every year, compounded year on year. So it has a massive ripple effect. And I know, particularly when I look back to the first year or two, not only was there an impact on the immediate family, Jordan's mother and I had separated and divorced some years earlier and got remarried. And, you know, both Jordan's stepmom and his mum severely impacted by the experience, his new siblings, if you like, his stepbrother and sister, his sister. But then there were very close immediate friends of Jordan's who still to this day, you know, struggle some 3.5 years on, and with the loss really of their, you know, very, very close friend. But then we started to recognize the impact it was having on his work colleagues, who I keep in touch with still. And even those ripple and knock-on effects where, when part of my role very early on was to go and speak to Jordan's mortgage company and his bank and utilities companies and anyone Jordan was dealing with, and you know, the impact of that conversation, having to have that conversation with those people as well, you could see the impact that it had on them. And because I'm particularly active on social media, what's started to happen during that first couple of years particularly were people that started to hear about the news, sometimes a year and a half on, that knew Jordan and maybe had worked with him in the past and had only for the first time come across the news. So there was that impact, because he was a very well-liked and well-loved individual. It almost sounds a cliche because we hear this on the news, when anyone's lost, but he was, and had a huge network of people that respected and loved him. So there was this continual sort of sense of loss, if you like, that was compounded through almost every conversation we continued to have over the first couple of years, certainly. Yeah, I think there were, again, in all difficult situations, even through the pandemic that we've been living through, there will always be kind of what we call positives that come out of that situation. As a unit, as you mentioned there, we had Jordan's girlfriend, we had Jordan's mum, his sister, and his stepmom, and we all formed this very tight unit on WhatsApp, and still to this day have that same WhatsApp group, and it's special for those messages. If we see a rainbow, we see a robin in the garden, these kind of things. It's that checking in little bit of space that continues to this day. But I even heard very similar from the neighbours where Jordan lived. He had his own house, lived in a small cul-de-sac of probably 20 houses, and how they created their own WhatsApp group to come together around Jordan's funeral and everything that was happening there, and have retained that group and that closeness, and will even come together for kind of a street party or a meal or a get together. As a legacy of being brought together through trauma, and that does, from my experience with the work that I'm doing now, tend to happen quite a lot. That you will find that we often describe suicide as being a club that nobody would want to be a member of, and it is a very unique club, I think, in many ways. But out of that comes a tremendous amount of love and collaboration and support, in those sort of circumstances. It became clearer that as I learned more about suicide, that suicide was something that doesn't affect everyone, but can impact anyone. So what we do with the Jordan Legacy is to look at collaborations through government, with organisations and workplaces, with schools, with communities, around real practical solutions. What are the practical things we should be doing if we are going to significantly reduce the number of suicides in the UK? And that's a very important part of our project. We deliver talks, we deliver online webinars. Not unusual to have several hundred people book and register to attend those. We ran our first Hope for Life physical conference at the end of 2021. We have another one happening at the end of 2023. More recently, we've been working on an action research project for suicide prevention, which we've titled Moving Toward a Zero Suicide Society. And the definition of that to us is a society that is willing and able to do everything it can to prevent all preventable suicides. So we've interviewed many people from various charities to workplaces to wellbeing consultants to politicians, to ask two main questions really, and that is, do you believe we can significantly reduce the number of suicides? And if so, how far do you think we can go? And our project is to bring together everyone in this space and answer those questions, and then look at what the practical solutions will be over the next 1 to 5 years to start moving toward that definition of a zero suicide society. There's two things for me that really kept me going. It's this absolute focus on the work we do with the Jordan Legacy to try and ensure as fewer people as possible end up in the situation that we did. So an absolute driver for me. It's a sense of purpose, and it's something I talk, I have conversations with many bereaved parents who often ask me the question, will it get better? Will it get easier? And my answer usually is that I can only really answer from my perspective, but I have had many conversations with others who are in a similar position in their journey to me, or even further down the line. And that is to say that it gets easier, but it never gets easy. But the most important thing is, do you have a sense of purpose? And that doesn't mean to say you have to go and set up a charity. It could be that it's about you going out for a walk every day where you haven't been doing that, or, maybe some simple routine things. But it is, for me, about having a sense of real purpose. I'm not a particularly religious or spiritual person in any way, but every morning and every evening I have behind me some photographs of Jordan and I on a trip we did to Italy when he was first diagnosed with clinical anxiety and depression in 2015. And my routine pretty well since that day has been first thing in the morning I come into my office and I speak to Jordan about the day and what we've got planned. And last thing before I go to bed, my wife knows to disappear, leave me for 5 minutes and have that conversation to talk to Jordan about the day. And in my way, and I've never been quite sure how to describe this, I do believe I'm talking to him, even though logically in my head I think that's probably not the case. But by doing that, that's kind of helped to keep Jordan with me, I think, and that lessens that pain. Because I do realize one thing, that 90% or more of the time I function well. The moment when I don't is that moment when I let my mind go to that day, to those events, to actually the magnitude of what has really happened. And I think it's at so those moments that, you know, just like now, you go there and you go, right, okay, need to get back, need to get focused. So it's kind of not lost on me that there may well come a time where I need to sit down with someone and have that conversation, because I will not always get up and do what I do. And I think I'm prepared for that. And I think, that's definitely in my mindset, that there may well come a day where I'll suddenly not function quite as well. But in the meantime, when I've got the energy and the strength, I'll keep that sense of purpose and keep focused.